Thanks very much.
Okay. Apollo 11 was the first mission of humans on the moon. It fulfilled a 1961 goal of President John F. Kennedy to send Americans to the moon and return them safely to Earth before the end of the decade. They launched on the 16th of July 1969 from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and after a 4-day translunar coast, they landed on the moon at the Sea of Tranquility. At 109 hours and 42 minutes mission elapsed time, Commander Neil A. Armstrong pressed his boot into the lunar soil and said those now famous words: "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." After a 2.5-hour walk around on the moon, they collected some soil samples, took some photos, and left some experiments behind. They then took off and returned back to Earth to a hero's welcome. All of these facts are widely known and have been told time and time again, but the subject of tonight's talk is on some of the lesser known facts about Apollo 11. I present to you 10 things you didn't know about Apollo 11. Number 1, the mission patch. Now, a little bit of history of mission patches. Flying squadron insignia or emblems were worn by pilots as a way of fostering a unique sense of identity. Since all the first astronauts came from a military flying background, it was of no surprise that they found their way into spaceflight as well. The Apollo 11 patch was primarily designed by the command module pilot, Mike Collins. He used the eagle as a symbol of America that he traced from a National Geographic magazine. They had the Earth, where they were coming from, and the moon, where they were going to. The eagle carried an olive branch as a sign of peace. And they also elected not to put their names on the patch so that everyone at NASA could feel involved with the mission. However, did you know, when the original design was submitted to the NASA officials for approval, it was actually rejected. When submitted, the olive branch was carried in the beak of the eagle, and the head of the Manned Spacecraft Center, Robert Gilruth, thought that the extended talons looked too warlike, so the olive branch was moved from the beak down to the claws. Much in the same way that the tradition of mission patches were brought into NASA by the pilots, so was the naming of the spacecraft. To quote Alan Shepard, the first American in space with the Mercury program, "Pilots have always named their planes. It's a tradition. It never occurred to me not to name the capsule." And he went to name his one Freedom 7. All of the other Mercury flights were given unique names by their respective pilots. Gus Grissom, on the second manned Mercury flight, Liberty Bell 7, had a mishap on landing, where a malfunction caused the explosive access door to blow away. This allowed seawater to fill the capsule until it sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. While he was absolved of any blame for the incident, his reputation was tarnished somewhat. As the American space program moved into the Gemini flights, Grissom, along with John Young, was slated for the first manned flight, Gemini 3. Not forgetting what happened to him back on his Mercury flight, Grissom named the capsule Molly Brown, after the Broadway play, The Unsinkable Molly Brown, a play about the real-life Margaret Brown who survived the sinking of the Titanic. NASA management, not knowing for their sense of humour, didn't see the funny side of Gus's name and decided that from now on, astronauts were no longer allowed to name their craft. So instead, the call signs were just whatever the flight name was, that being Gemini 3 and 4, all the way out to Gemini 12. This continued on into the Apollo program with Apollo 7 and Apollo 8. However, by the time that Apollo 9 rolled around, NASA officials realised that once again they'd be operating 2 spacecraft at the same time. So they now allowed the crews to name their capsules. Apollo 9 named the Command and Service Module Gumdrop because of the blue plastic coating that it came from North American Aviation. and the lunar module Spider because of the appearance when the landing legs were extended. The NASA Public Relations Department thought that the names were a little bit too informal, but they ultimately accepted them. Although the next crew were asked to choose something a little bit more fitting. Apollo 10 was a full dress rehearsal for the lunar landing where they would fly down to only 15 kilometres from the surface. Because of the serious nature of the mission and the crew being huge fans of Charles Schulz's comic strip Peanuts, they named the CSM Charlie Brown and the lunar module Snoopy, because they were going to be snooping down around the landing site. Which brings us to Apollo 11. The Assistant Manager for Public Affairs, Julian Scheer, wrote to George Low, the manager of the Apollo spacecraft program, and suggested that maybe Apollo 11 be a little less flippant with the naming of their spacecraft. However, did you know? After thinking long and hard about it and trying a few different call signs during their simulator sessions, what names did the crew of Apollo 11 settle on? Does anyone know?
Yes. Columbia and Eagle.
Snow Cone and Haystack. These were the names that they used during the simulator sessions until literally only a few months before the actual flight, where the real names were settled on. I don't need to tell you that flying in space is dangerous. From the beginning with Project Mercury, the selection of the 7 test pilots into that project, astronauts have found it nearly impossible to get life insurance. While they were handsomely paid to do the job, some of the perks including almost never having to pay for drinks and being able to lease a brand new Chevy Corvette for only $1 a year, and here we see Al Shepard picking up the keys to his. If something disastrous did happen on a flight and they didn't make it back, their families would have been left high and dry, remembering this was the 50s and 60s, where the wife traditionally stayed at home and the husbands worked. Being government employees, they were forbidden for being compensated for radio or television appearances or product endorsements, but they were allowed to sell their personal stories. NASA allowed Life magazine exclusive rights to their stories, and for that access, they, the astronauts, were paid $500,000 a year, split 7 ways, or approximately $71,000 each in 1960s money. Most of the astronauts invested into businesses, so to bring in some sort of income for their families. Al Shepard famously bought into a oil drilling operation in Texas, something that made him and his wife multimillionaires by the time they left NASA. As NASA employed more and more pilots, the $500,000 pie was getting sliced thinner and thinner, which meant the astronauts now had to come up with more creative ways to provide for their families. However, did you know how the crew of Apollo 11 did it? Stamps, or more accurately, signed envelopes and covers. Stamp collecting was quite popular in the 60s, and in the weeks leading up to launch, while they were in quarantine, one of their backup crew went to the Houston Space Center visitors shop and collected up all the commemorative envelopes. The 3 crew members then signed almost 1,000 of them, leaving these insurance covers behind to be postmarked on the 20th of July, the day of the lunar landing, and to be sold just in case something happened. One of these covers sold only a couple of years ago for $8,000 US. On a flight, each astronaut has what's known as a personal preference kit, or PPK. It's a small fireproof bag which they can carry small items of a private nature, and here we see Mike Collins' PPK from Apollo 11. The crew decided to take along with them some of the covers in their own PPKs and sign them when they got back to Earth. And here we see the actual paper bag that came from the visitor's shop, and in Buzz's own handwriting listing how many covers they took with them. Armstrong took 47, Collins 63, and Aldrin 104, totaling 214 envelopes and signed by Buzz. While they were completing their quarantine on arrival back on Earth, Neil, Mike and Buzz signed these now space-flown covers. While Buzz started selling his pretty much from the moment he got out, Neil never sold any of his ones. They were only released to the public on his death in 2012. At auction, the first few reached as high as $30,000 US, and today the asking price can go a lot higher. All of the covers were individually numbered, and here we see Neil's with the initials NA and the number 28, and in Neil's own handwriting, carried to the moon on Apollo 11. These flown covers were all postmarked the day of their release from the quarantine facility, and here we see the date, August the 11th, 1969, and the stamp from the postmaster, delayed in quarantine at the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston, Texas. This particular cover, NA28, sold in 2018 for $156,000. As I said earlier, spaceflight is dangerous, and no flight could be potentially as dangerous as the first attempt at a manned lunar landing. But did you know? Just in case something did happen, the lunar module crashed or they were unable to lift off from the moon, President Nixon had a speech prepared to read to the public. Known as the Sophia Memo, its existence only came to light when Nixon's papers were released upon his death in 1994, and the contents is quite an eye-opener. Nixon asked his major speechwriter, William Sophia, to draft a speech and whatever protocols the administration might follow in the event of a catastrophe. Only 2 days before the launch, the memo was delivered to Nixon's chief of staff. It contained the speech and also that the president was to ring the wives of the astronauts beforehand. After the announcement, a clergyman would have commended their souls to the deepest of the deep in a ritual likened to a burial at sea. At that time, Mission Control would have severed all communications with the lunar module. So what did the memo say? Well, titled, "In Event of Moon Disaster," I quote, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery, but they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice." But as we know, they did get back from the moon safely, and the speech was never used. Number 5, stuck on the moon. However, did you know there were actually 2 opportunities during their time on the surface that they may not have been able to leave? The first was as Buzz was descending the ladder. One of his tasks was to close the door behind him. This was done to prevent radiative cooling of the cabin and prevent possible damage to the components inside. If we zoom in here, we can see that the door is not quite closed. So why would this be a problem? Well, if any of the valves inside the cabin that were used for the pressurization system leaked, even a small amount of pressure behind the door would have made it virtually impossible for them to open it from the outside. While the hatch did contain a vent valve that we can see just here, if any leak was greater than what the valve could handle, they would have never been able to get the pressure low enough to get the door open. Because of this, he elected to leave it cracked ever so slightly. We'll leave Buzz here to finish climbing down a ladder because another did you know moment was about to happen a few seconds after this photo taken, but we'll have a look at that later on. The second issue arose later in the mission, and as they were getting ready to take off, and it centres around this little guy, an aircraft-style push-pull circuit breaker. And I do have one we can pass around. There we go. What a circuit breaker does is it acts like a fuse in case of an electrical overload in a system. And it can also act as a switch to be able to isolate that system just by pulling out the plunger. Soon after landing, certain engine and radar-related systems were turned off by pulling out their respective circuit breakers. And they would be required to be pushed back in later on to allow Neil and Buzz to get off the moon and back up to Mike Collins in Columbia. You're most welcome to play with those. And here we see the layout of the cabin of the lunar module. The commander stands on the left with his control stick and window. The central instrument panel is in the center, and the lunar module pilot, who doesn't actually pilot the lunar module, stands on the right. One thing to note is just how cramped it is in there, especially when both the astronauts are fully suited up. We're going to look at the two circuit breaker panels. Panel 11 is over on Neil's side, and the one we're interested in, panel 16, is over on Buzz's side on the right. In this close-up of panel 16, we're interested in one in particular, the ascent engine arm breaker. When this is pushed in, it energizes three main systems. Firstly, the explosive guillotines that will sever the wiring and the oxygen umbilicals that go from the ascent module to the descent module below their feet. Secondly, the four explosive bolts that hold the upper and lower modules together. And finally, the engine fuel valves. With these systems all armed, all Neil has to do is press the go button and they would launch off the moon. So, as you can see, it's quite an important circuit breaker. So what actually happened? Having a look at this picture of Buzz while he's saluting the flag, one thing you'll notice is just how far the portable life support system, or PLIS backpack, sticks out behind him. After they had re-entered the lunar module and while they were removing their backpacks so they could get something to eat and some well-earned sleep, Buzz accidentally broke off the plunger of the circuit breaker, preventing it from being closed. From this point, they were technically stranded on the moon, and it looked as though maybe President Nixon might get to use that speech after all. If you were to ever read the transcripts of the mission, one thing that stands out that is at no time during this potentially disastrous event did Neil or Buzz panic, showing just exactly why NASA chose these pilots for the space program. Soon, however, Buzz realized that the pen he was carrying fitted perfectly into the broken breaker, and when the time came, he would be able to push it closed and they would be able to make it back home. And here is Buzz with the pen and the broken piece of circuit breaker that he brought back with him as a memento. While Buzz's repair worked, they did manage to take off with no issues. The potentially serious nature of the incident was not lost on the NASA engineers. However, did you know what solution they came up with? Yep, jumper cables, or as NASA calls them, the explosive device and ascent propulsion system in emergency contingency cables. Yeah. While I wasn't able to find a picture of the actual cables, I'll try and describe the process that they would have had to go through from the Lunar Module Operation Procedures Handbook, because it's nothing short of an adventure. First, let's set the scene. The lunar module will be pressurized to 3.5 psi. The crew would be fully suited up in their A7L spacesuits, complete with helmets. They'd be connected to the lunar module's internal oxygen and cooling system via a short hose connected to these blue and red connections on the front there. And the PLIS backpacks that they wore on the outside and the surface would have been discarded out the door and be sitting in a pile at the bottom of the ladder, along with any rubbish that they didn't need to take back with them. If they encountered a problem similar to what Apollo 11 had, the cabin would have to be depressurized. As that was going on, each crew member would be checking the integrity of their own suit. Whichever of them had the better result from those checks would be the one who drew the short straw to go back outside. The lucky astronaut would then connect themselves to a 10-metre long oxygen hose and disconnect the shorter ones, as well as grabbing the 6-metre long jumper cables, and make their way back down the ladder. Keep in mind a couple of things. At the foot of the ladder was the pile of rubbish and the PLIS backpacks, and when wearing a helmet in a now stiff pressurised suit, you can't actually look straight down and see your feet. Also, because they weren't wearing the backpacks, they also wouldn't have the full water cooling in their suit. So this entire task could take no longer than half an hour, or you'd risk overheating the astronaut. So where was our lucky astronaut heading to? Having a close look at the descent module structure, we can see that it is made up of interlocked square sections. The central one contains the engine. The ones to the left and right, forward and aft, contain the fuel tanks. And off those mount the 4 landing gear. This leaves us these triangular sections in the corner which are used for storage. And the one we're interested in is quadrant number 4, just to the left of the ladder. Quad 4 contains the modular equipment stowage assembly, or the mesa. The mesa is a drop-down hinged panel that held most of the equipment that the astronauts would need while they're on the moon. Most notably, it also contained the TV camera that filmed them coming down the ladder. What they would have to do is rip away at the Kapton thermal foil next to the American flag just here, possibly with help from the scissors from the first aid kit. Behind the foil was a pair of batteries, which they would then plug the jumper cables to. They would now head back inside and gain access behind circuit breaker number 11, which is on the left-hand side, and connect the cable to the back of the engine start override circuit breaker. They would have to hold on to something because from the moment the jumper cable touched the connector, the entire launch circuit was live and they'd instantly be launched back into orbit, with the door open, trailing the ED-APS cable out behind them. Once they were safely in orbit, they could throw the cable out, close the hatch, and carry on to rendezvous with the command and service module. I think it's about enough fun and games for the takeoff, so let's have a look at some of the things that happened during the landing. Much has been made of the multiple program alarms that occurred during the landing phase, warning everyone that the guidance computer was getting overloaded. It definitely caused quite a breathless moment for those back at mission control and became an unwanted distraction for the two pilots in the lunar module. When the first of the 6 alarms went off, Neil's heart rate rose to nearly 160 beats a minute. It was only good training and quick thinking by the team back at mission control, telling them that they could ignore the alarms, thus preventing an abort, that allowed them to carry on to the surface. The Apollo guidance computer provided computation and electronic interfaces for guidance, navigation, and control of the spacecraft. Both the CSM and the lunar module had their own separate guidance computer. Here we see the central control panel for the lunar module. This is where the pilots could get the readings back from the guidance computer, mostly in the form of aircraft-style gauges and displays, which was something they were already quite familiar with. And between them was the numeric display and keyboard, or known as the DISCI, where they could input data and change whatever computer program was needed depending on what phase of the flight they were in. Also included in this system was a smaller, simpler secondary computer called the abort guidance system, which was to be used in an emergency, and its only job was to get them back to the command and service module. What I'm about to go over is an extremely oversimplified explanation of what is actually quite a complicated system. So, the Apollo guidance computer could work on only 8 tasks at a time using what were called core sets. The computer would cycle through these core sets thousands of times a second to get the tasks completed. And while it doesn't sound like much compared to today's computers, it was actually cutting edge of the time and more than enough necessary to land on the moon. During the braking and landing portion of the flight, the guidance computer was working at near maximum capacity. At about 5 minutes into the landing, Buzz went to change the information that was being displayed on the DISCI when suddenly all the alarm lights lit up on the central console and an audible warning sounded in their headphones. Program alarm, 12:02. It was something they'd never seen before in their training, and their initial thought was they were going to have to abort. However, did you know the alarms were actually unintentionally self-inflicted? During the landing, the selected landing program would require 5 of the 8 core sets. Earlier in the flight, Buzz had requested back to mission control that the rendezvous radar be left on. The rendezvous radar was not needed for landing, but it was used during takeoff or during an abort. And the thinking was they could find the command module quicker if it was already turned on and locked onto the CSM. However, what was not realised at the time was the rendezvous radar switch was put into the wrong position. So instead of feeding its data into the abort system, it was feeding it back into the main guidance computer. The upshot of this was it took up almost all of the last 3 available core sets. So when Buzz wanted to change what was being displayed on the DISCI, there was no room available. His was a 9th task and just one too many. So as soon as he pressed enter, program alarm, 12:02. Executive overflow, no more core sets. As I mentioned a moment ago, they'd never seen this alarm before, so Buzz called back to Mission Control for advice. What to them must have seemed like an eternity, but in fact was only about 20 seconds. They radioed back that it was okay to carry on. The computer was still doing its main job. After 5 more attempts, Buzz realised that the 1201 and 1202 executive overflow alarms were happening every time he tried to change the diski, so he decided just to leave it where it was. At the time, no one realised that the radar switch was in the wrong position, nor the consequences of such an error. Within a day, however, the software specialists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who wrote the code for the guidance computer worked out what had happened. The procedures were updated for the following missions, and the alarms never came back. So let's cover off they only had 10 seconds of fuel remaining, or 5 seconds, or 15 seconds of fuel remaining, depending on which movie or book or whatever you're reading at the time. Before we go into details, let's have another quick look at the descent module's fuel tanks. As I mentioned earlier, it's made up of these square sections. Central one has the engine, and the left and right, forward and aft one, have the tanks. And here in this cutaway view, we can see the fuel tanks. The red ones carried 4,000 litres of fuel, and the 2 teal-coloured ones carried 3,500 litres of oxidizer. As you can see, the tanks are curved on the top and the bottom, and curved tanks are notoriously difficult to get an accurate reading from, especially when they're getting near empty. So let's have a close look at the transcript of the final couple of minutes of the landing. To give you an idea what's happening, let's have a look at the first line. We're at 102 hours, 44 minutes, 16 seconds mission elapsed time. Just for clarity, we're going to ignore the 102 hours bit. They are currently 220 feet above the ground. They are descending 3.5 feet a second, and they are moving forward 13.5 feet a second. Buzz is on what's called Vox, or hot mic. That is, as soon as he speaks, his voice is being transmitted. Armstrong, on the other hand, is on what's called press to talk. So he has to press the microphone button to be able to be heard, but he's not being broadcast. Only Aldrin can hear him. And down here at 44 minutes and 45 seconds, Aldrin calls out 5% quantity light. They only have 5% fuel remaining in the tanks, and they now have 60 seconds to get down. 17 seconds later, Mission Control acknowledges that they are also seeing the low fuel warning on their screens too by radioing back 60 seconds. By this stage, they're getting pretty close to the surface. Here we are, they're at 40 feet. They're now at 30 feet. At this stage, Armstrong is concentrating, looking out the window at the landing site, and Aldrin is focused solely on looking at the gauges and reading them out to Neil. That Mission Control has to remind them they only got 30 seconds of fuel left. And here, at 45 minutes and 40 seconds, Aldrin calls out contact light, confirming that one of the long probes on the landing gear pads has touched the lunar surface. Neil then shuts down the engine, which Buzz confirms. They then go through their after landing checklists. And Neil presses the transmit button and says those now famous words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." Doing some rough calculations, we can see that from Aldrin's initial 60-second fuel call back at 44 minutes and 45 seconds, a total of 55 seconds has elapsed until he called contact light. So does that mean they actually had only 5 seconds of fuel left? Or from the time that Mission Control reminded them they only had 30 seconds, they landed a scant 9 seconds later. So does that mean they actually had 21 seconds of fuel left? Did you know it was actually none of these? The 60-second warning wasn't that they were going to run out of fuel, which is what is usually reported. Knowing that low fuel level was hard to read in a curved tank, and with what fuel was in there sloshing around, the engineers had actually built in quite a safety margin into their calculations. The 60 seconds was actually a countdown to a decision point, or in flying terminology, a bingo point. On Apollo 11, if the counter reached 0, they would still have between 20 and 40 seconds to either land or level off and hit the abort button. So in reality, they actually had plenty of fuel to comfortably land. As I said earlier, during number 5, we'll come back to the picture of Buzz descending the ladder onto the moon's surface. And here he is, just after leaving the door cracked. But before we continue, I'd just like to go over a little bit of background information that will lead us up to the next Did You Know? Here we see Eagle just as she's undocked from Columbia. Here we see Eagle just after she's undocked from Columbia. And a couple of things to note. While the descent engine was on a very low power setting on landing, the engineers were worried that the exhaust plume would reflect off the surface and go back up inside the engine bell and potentially cause an explosion. To prevent this from happening, the commander who was doing the flying was instructed that if any one of the almost 2-meter long probes seen here were to touch the surface, they were to immediately switch off the engine and drop it in for a landing. In doing so, the landing gear legs would compress and shorten by almost 60 centimetres. This also had the added benefit of placing the bottom rung of the ladder closer to the ground. All of the pilots actually had trouble doing this because it went against years and years of training where you tried to land your aircraft as gently as possible. And Neil was no different. When Buzz called out contact light, he still had the engine running when the pads finally came in contact with the lunar soil. This meant that the legs had hardly compressed and the bottom rung of the ladder was nearly 90 centimetres off the ground. However, did you know? When Buzz jumped from the lower rung onto the landing pad, unknown to him at the time, the tube from his urine collection device broke. So for the entire 2.5-hour EVA, he was urinating into his own boots. And to quote him from a magazine article, he was kind of sloshing around on the surface. Which makes this famous photo take on a whole new meaning. Number 10, where are you? The primary objective of the first attempt at a manned lunar landing was just to land. Getting soil samples and taking photos was secondary to literally just getting her down. NASA had selected 5 possible landing sites for Apollo 11, and after studying high-resolution photos that were available at the time, landing zone number 2 in the Sea of Tranquility was selected. So where is the Sea of Tranquility? So having a look at the moon here, now this is in northern hemisphere orientation, so the north is at the top, south at the bottom. We can see over on the left-hand side here, quite a mess of lunar seas, very bright Tycho crater, and some lighter coloured highlands here. And over on the right, some almost circular interjoined seas. The Sea of Serenity is at the top, the Sea of Fertility is at the bottom, and in the middle, the Sea of Tranquility. Zooming into the Sea of Tranquility, we are interested in this bottom left-hand corner here, next to this little bright crater. Now this photo here was taken from the Eagle a few minutes after undocking, looking back down at Columbia, which we can see here. Since a precision landing was not expected for the first mission, the target area was an ellipse measuring some 20 kilometres by 5 kilometres, with the program touchdown point being the cross in the middle. They would be approaching the landing site from the east or the right-hand side as we're looking at it here. However, due to a small mistake during undocking, during the landing, Neil found themselves reaching their programmed waypoints some 3 seconds early, which meant they'd be landing long or well past the cross, somewhere in this area here, some 7 kilometres downrange. While still some 2,000 feet in altitude and still a few kilometres from the landing site, Neil was finally able to take his attention away from the annoying program alarms and have a good look outside, and he didn't like the view. The computer was taking them towards the edge of a 200-metre wide, then unnamed crater, which was surrounded by a boulder field with rocks up to 2 to 3 metres in size. Fearing the worst, he took manual control of the landing, slowed the descent rate to almost zero, and let the lunar module fly on even further. He soon found some relatively flat ground just beyond a small crater that he overflew to come in for a nice, safe landing. However, did you know, along with all the computer alarms, waypoint issues, and trying to find a suitable spot to land on, albeit some 7.5 kilometres from their intended target, no one, not even Neil and Buzz, knew exactly where they had landed. They had with them nearly 50 maps of various places within the landing zone, but none of them matched what they were seeing outside their windows. Even Mike Collins, orbiting high above in the command and service module, and with the help of the team back at Mission Control, tried to find them, but to no avail. With the landing zone covering an area of over 300 square kilometres, it was quite literally like trying to find a needle in a haystack, or, going by the original name of the lunar module, looking for a haystack in a big grey pile of dirt. Here we see a panorama from that was made up from some of the shots that Neil took from that small crater that they flew over when they came into land. As you can see, it's pretty featureless, and Buzz's description of magnificent desolation is quite apt. It actually wasn't until many months after they got back to Earth that the lunar geology experts finally found out where they had landed after developing and studying the many photographs that were taken during the moonwalk. During Apollo 11, with public focus being on the landing and the EVA, it's easy to forget about the third member of the crew, Command Module pilot Michael Collins, orbiting some 100 kilometres above in Columbia. He was called many things during the flight, from the forgotten astronaut to the loneliest man in the world. Even a NASA public affairs press release on the 21st of July said, "Not since Adam has any human known such solitude as Mike Collins, that he's experiencing during his 47 minutes of each lunar revolution when he is behind the moon with no one to talk to." However, personally, he felt very much part of the mission. He said he felt awareness, anticipation, satisfaction, and confidence, but not loneliness. In his autobiography, he wrote, "This venture has been structured for 3 men, and I consider my third to be as necessary as the other 2. He went on to say, "It was perfectly enjoyable. I had hot coffee and music if I wanted it." Mike's main tasks while he was in orbit was to try and find the lunar module on the surface and to keep the spacecraft in working order for when Neil and Buzz were to return from the moon. This included making sure that the guidance computer was aligned properly and hadn't drifted at all. This was checked taking sightings of known bright stars with a sextant and comparing those figures to where the computer thought they were and making any adjustments as necessary. During the flight, Columbia gave virtually no issues, in no small part to Mike's engineering and piloting skills and having such a well-built spacecraft. But did you know what he did to show his gratitude? On the second night back on Earth, while they were still on the recovery ship, the USS Hornet, steaming back to Hawaii, he crawled back into Columbia, went down into the lower equipment bay where the sextant mount was, took out a pen and wrote, "Spacecraft 107, alias Apollo 11, alias Columbia, the best ship to come down the line. God bless her, Michael Collins, CMP." The inscription only really came to public light in 2015 after the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum took the opportunity to accurately photograph and 3D scan the entire interior of Columbia. Number 12, just breathe. On the 16th of July, on the morning of the launch, the astronauts were woken up at 4 a.m, and by 5 a.m. they were having the traditional pre-launch breakfast of steak, eggs and coffee. An hour later, they were helped into their A7L spacesuits before the long bus ride out to the waiting Saturn V rocket at Launch Complex 39A. But did you know, from the moment they put on their helmets, it would be the last time for 25 days that they would get to breathe all natural air. Once in their spacesuits, they carried a portable breathing and cooling unit, which was enough to get them out to the launch pad and connected to the spacecraft supply. Spacecraft's oxygen was, of course, plenty from the trip to the moon and back. They then splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on the 24th of July, just southwest of Hawaii. The possibility of bringing back pathogens from the lunar surface was considered remote, but NASA took no precautions. While they were still in their suits and connected to the command module's oxygen supply, Navy divers opened the hatch and passed in biological isolation garments, or BIGs. They were basically biohazard suits, and as you can see, they had very large filters attached to the face mask. So even though they were back on Earth, they were still not able to breathe fresh air. They were then winched aboard a helicopter and transferred to the waiting carrier, the USS Hornet. There they walked from the helicopter to what was known as the Mobile Quarantine Facility, which was actually just a heavily modified holiday caravan built with a built-in air purification system. The Hornet then steamed back to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. While still inside the MQF, the crew were loaded onto a transport plane and flown all the way from Hawaii back to the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas. Only then were the crew able to get out of the cramped confines of the MQF and via an airlock system into the spacious Lunar Receiving Laboratory. The facility was specially designed and built to isolate the astronauts and the rock samples that were being returned back from the moon. And while he was in the LRL, Neil celebrated his 39th birthday. Finally, on the 10th of August, some 25 days after donning their helmets back on launch day, were the crew allowed to leave the mandatory quarantine, hug their families and breathe fresh air. And just a quick one to finish. Did you know, the pointer works, while they weren't required to, the crew thought it would be fun to fill in a customs declaration form on arrival in Hawaii. Here we see the flight number is Apollo 11, departed from the moon, arriving Honolulu, Hawaii, and the signatures of the 3 astronauts. Over on the right-hand side, under cargo, yes, moon rock and moon dust. And here a little poke at having to quarantine because of possible moon bugs. Any conditions on board which may lead to the spread of disease? Yes, to be determined. This quite famous form is now proudly displayed at the US Customs and Border Protection archives. That is the end. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope that there were some things in there that made you go, wow, I didn't know that. Thank you very much. Any questions? Excellent.
I have a question. Do you know the time that they landed in New Zealand time? What was the time in New Zealand?
Funny enough, my previous one I did here, which was the Soviet side of the space race, I did have that exact, it was 2:45 in the afternoon. It was literally for New Zealand time. It was just coming up afternoon smoko from memory. Yeah. Yeah.
Great presentation. Yeah, so during the Apollo missions, we were using the Zeiss telescope as part of a worldwide request from the IAU, I think, to keep the moon under close observation while the astronauts were in the vicinity of the moon. And so at that stage, we were only had the Zeiss telescope, which was a great one to have, best in the country at that time. And so we did it visually, just watching the moon, particularly the crater Aristarchus. They were just wanting, there've been sort of reports over long period of time, a century or more, people seeing lights on the moon and whatever, but never been really validated or fully understood. So they were using this as an opportunity to try to resolve whether these were actually real things or not. So we chose Aristarchus because Harry Williams, who was helping me on the Zeiss do it, and he was curator of instruments for the observatory at the time. So it had just been a hobby of his to observe Aristarchus, and so Harry used to spend a lot of time in his own telescope in Mount Eden, drawing, as they did then, because the photography was pretty crude, just drawing Aristarchus with lots of different lighting conditions. People had reported seeing flashes of light and brightenings associated with Aristarchus. Could have been light reflecting off some ice in the soil or something like that. We don't know. But that was why we were looking at Aristarchus. So we monitored it through most of the missions where the times were favourable in New Zealand, and didn't see anything. I don't think the whole project internationally found anything particularly outstanding. You might know more.
No, I've read something about that people have visually seen it, but they've never actually captured it on camera.
Craft. It was mainly just that the idea that maybe the moon was outgassing stuff every now and again. Some stuff would come popping out, or maybe a meteorite had banged into a crater and created dust. The mission
that reflected.
These
that was sort of
the explanations at the time.
The explanation, yes.
Did the three astronauts maintain a connection for the rest of their lives, or did they kind of go separate ways or something?
Neil himself pretty much disappeared. He did the required couple of years or 18 months of touring around the world and ticker tape parade and that, and then just withdrew from public life and went to be a university professor from memory and that. And it was only sort of later on, as some of the major anniversaries sort of popped up, that they were sort of all photographed together once again. And that. The most vocal one that's kept of public appearance is obviously Buzz. And that seems to thrive off it. So. Yes.
I have watched some videos doubting that the moon landing mission was fake. For example, they look at the pictures and check out the flag, like, because there's no atmosphere on the moon. How did the flag blow like that?
Mythbusters did a very, very good episode explaining that. They were having trouble getting no one really knew, and they couldn't get too much information even from the surveyor probes. It was just what the surface was really like. And one thing they found, actually I do have, just before I answer your question, the squiggly lines are all their footprints. We've got the lunar module here. If you overlaid it, they never walked any further than a soccer field. It was actually very, very close. This picture here is of the crater. You can see that, thank you for the lights, there's only a very thin dust layer on the surface. Underneath the rock is actually quite hard. What's interesting to note here is you see this big scarch here from the landing gear probe, showing that Neil was actually sliding sideways when he landed as well. But as you can see, all the dust has been blown off. And that's the problem they had, trying to get through that to get the pole into the ground. While they were doing that, they were wiggling the thing. You go have a look at the footage. They're sitting there literally trying to get it into the ground. Of course, that's why the flag's waving. And there's the footage from the camera that was above Buzz's window, looking out at quite a steep angle back outside. You see the flag fall over as soon as they took off and laying on the ground. With this one here, on the landing site, one of the photos showed this little point right here that was known as the cat's paw crater. Whoop, wrong way. Back. That was this complex right here known as the cat's paw craters. And it was about 6 kilometres away over the horizon. And that's the only shot they had of it. And that's what took them so long to find out where they were. Was that? So, yes.
The previous photo, which you said had the command, that's the command module. No, sorry, the one you just went past.
Oh, sorry. That one?
Yeah, so you said that's the command module above the ellipse.
Yes.
So,
looking straight back at them. So there's the docking port, there's the 4 omnidirectional.
and this
You
is
think-
just detached.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I thought they were actually sideways when they did, but they.
but I would have thought, given that they were both in orbit, the landing site wouldn't be directly below them when they detached.
When they detached, they did, and then they went behind apart. And that's when they both came around separately. They had problems re-establishing radio contact. Yeah, yeah, because they had the checklists and everything to go through, which took some time.
So
Yeah.
kind of, is it a coincidence that they separated at that point, or was that...
For this one, no, they wanted to take a lot of photos.
Right.
And they did a very similar thing on 10 as well to get the photos of it as well.
Okay.
So is the command module below the
Yes.
lunar module?
At that point, yeah.
At that point.
So how did they get higher?
Wasn't a perfect circle. So at that point, it was below. They didn't detach right here. They actually probably detached 15 minutes, half an hour earlier.
Right.
They just happened to be coming around. And of course, one's orbiting one way and there's just that slight separation.
Already has 2.
Sorry?
It already has 2 because it was
Yes.
upside down.
There's one thing they did, it took a lot of photos. There's very good archives online, you can go have a look at them. And
Going vertical above the moon, is that not horizontal?
correct, that's looking straight back down.
We're getting horizontal around the moon.
What it was. They're looking straight at us.
No, the command module.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yes.
Do they have photos now of what's left on there?
I think most countries that have got some sort of orbiter up there now have tried to take photos of it to varying degrees.
We saw that last time.
Yeah.
The Japanese cameras and probes have taken quite detailed pictures.
Oh, okay.
The one that I used of the landing site that I circled, it was the American probe that's up there, orbiter. And that's probably one of the better photos of it.
Yes. A bit of a badly told anecdote. You mentioned about the fuel amount, and there was a podcast series which must have been on the 50th anniversary, and it was one of the engineers back at the control center whose job was to time the when the fuel might come on, and he had a stopwatch, a sort of analog, an old fashion, a 1969 stopwatch, and he clicked it when they landed, and it said something like 23 seconds or a particular number. Anyway, he took it home, put it in his drawer, and sometime later he went back to it, and it said like 13 seconds or something different. I thought, what the heck, I'm sure it said 23. And it turned out his kids had been playing with a stopwatch, and then they just arbitrarily said, oh, it wasn't 0, so we better put it on stopwatch.
That's good. That's nice. Yes.
People say they, in New Zealand, saw it on TV, but we had no television satellite coverage in that time. And I understand that the airports had a Hercules in Australia to pick up
Canberra jet, I think.
Yeah, there was.
I think it was a Canberra.
They literally raced over and got the videotape
from Australia.
and raced it back for the news. So yeah, in this country, no, and even it wasn't even in the format that they could use. It still had to be all laced back together to be able to be shown. So no, was not shown live, regardless of what people remember or what is shown in the movies.
It was on the radio.
It was definitely on the radio. Yes, that was good. But yeah, the footage. So when kids go, oh, I remember sitting in class watching it live. No, you probably watched the video the day or two after. So.
Yeah, well, we sat around we had a little transistor radio at Mount Grammar when I was in my last year at grammar school. But it was in the history class actually, we decided, including the teacher, decided to stop and listen to the radio broadcast.
Makes a history.
I was in a music class and we listened on the radiogram. Rest of the school had it on the PA system.
Did they have any difficulty getting back on the ladder? Because the ladder is quite high.
No, because of the low gravity, it was very easy to bounce back up. Who was it? Someone missed first time. It was either Neil or Buzz. And they realised just how high it was, and they just gave it a little bit extra oomph and got up there.
You already said they left the main backpack.
To keep the weight down, yeah. The last things they did was throw everything out, including any rubbish and everything, just to give them that safety to get back.
All the urine out of the boot and shit. I couldn't make the snow after 3 days.
The only one that's really mentioned it was Lovell and Borman on Gemini, where they had to stay inside for 14 days just to prove the thing of just how much it smelt inside the capsule once they got back. But apparently reports are the International Space Station is very similar. So, the things they don't really talk about. Well, that's it for the question. If I could grab that circuit breaker back, please. Oh, it's just up there. Marvellous. Great. Thank you very much. Cheers.